Hello and welcome to this episode of A Legacy of Revival, the SHBC Connection. I'm Gene Hildebrand, Community Outreach Coordinator here at Sharer Hills, and it's my pleasure to welcome you again to this episode, and we're excited about the guest that we have with us today. Her name is Priscilla Fisher, and she serves here currently as the librarian at our church, and has been a member for how long, Priscilla?
Over 40 years.
Over 40 years.
With some breaks in between, but yes,
and
well
so
over 40.
And significantly, for this podcast, she is the great niece of Dr. Charles Culpepper and his wife, Ola. So thank you for being here, Priscilla. It's really a pleasure.
My pleasure.
I've been looking forward to this for a long time. And you know, it's important that we kind of flesh out the man of God, you know, and make him personal, because of course he was a human being. And so when we focus upon the ministry of the Culpeppers, and the ministry certainly was a shared ministry with Charles and Ola together on the mission field, as well as when they returned here to San Antonio. But we want to know the man as well as the mission or the ministry that they served in as well. So what can you tell us about Charles and Ola Culpepper?
Well, first of all, I'll explain our relationship. Aunt Ola, I call them Aunt Ola and Uncle Charlie.
And
That's
Uncle
how
Charlie.
I know them.
Right.
Aunt Ola was the sister to my grandmother, Alice Presley. And we, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of memories through my childhood, because those were the years that they were in China.
Right,
you know,
right.
I knew that they were missionaries in China, and I was always very proud of that. I thought it was really special to have missionaries in my family.
Representing your family.
In our family, and I thought maybe it'd give me an in, you know, with the Lord. Of course, that's not true at all. But they were wonderful people, and we would see them occasionally when they would come home on furlough. Yeah. And but they stayed busy even on furlough. They would always, Uncle Charlie was always speaking to churches and sharing the message of what was going on in China.
Yeah.
And so unfortunately, we didn't get to spend a whole lot of time with them until toward the end, when they did finally retire and spend a little bit more time here in San Antonio.
And they retired in 1964, I believe.
1965, right. And I was figuring that up in my head. I thought, wow, he was born in 1895, so he was 70. He worked on the mission field until he was 70 years old. And
of course, one of the things that he's very clear about is that he at one point promised God that he would preach till his very last breath.
He did.
And he evidently made good on that commitment.
I believe he did.
Yeah.
I believe he did.
So he was, when he retired from the foreign mission field, but he retired to the home mission field, if you will.
That's exactly right.
And so he just turned a page and moved into a different chapter.
That's right.
But he continued to do the same work as he had always done. In fact, at one point he ended up in a wheelchair, which I only recently learned. And
see, I have very little memory of that.
Yeah.
I don't remember him being in a wheelchair.
And yet he continued to minister even out of a wheelchair. So, you know, what a testament of the Spirit of God empowering a man to do near impossible things.
Oh, Amen. I know. It's amazing. In reading the book that we have available to us about the Shantung revival, and then he also wrote an autobiography of himself,
right.
And that filled in a lot of holes for me of things that I did not know about him. But you know, growing up, they had a tough life. I mean, he was a child in the early 1900s.
Right.
they didn't have electricity or, indoor plumbing or cars to ride around in, I'm sure, at first. And so I think having that kind of upbringing and in that time period made him a very strong, courageous man.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this before necessarily, but the deprivations, maybe that's too strong a word, but for this purpose, the deprivations that he experienced as a child probably helped prepare him for the kind of life that he was going to lead for 40 more years in China, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it wasn't like there was that big a deal, maybe to some extent, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. His father died early, and, even like as a 9-year-old almost, he was kind of like the man of the house, even though his father had had a wife prior to his mother marrying him, and so there were older children, but they were like already grown and pretty much gone.
Okay.
So as far as his upbringing at that point, once his father had passed, they had a pretty tough time of it with his mom, and he had brothers and other brother and several sisters, and they had to work hard on a farm to just make do.
So for clarification, he was born in Lavaca County, which I believe is where Shiner, Texas is located. Not sure just exactly where their homestead was, but as you said, upon his father's passing, they came to San Antonio, and so San Antonio was his home.
Well, San Antonio area. I don't think they were in the midst of San Antonio exactly where they lived.
Okay.
It was
So it's still been in the country.
In fact, I've wondered if perhaps they lived, my Aunt Ola and my grandmother lived in near Center Point.
Right.
Which is not very far from here.
Right.
And I don't think they met until they went to Baylor.
Right.
Maybe I think
Right.
Aunt Ola and Uncle Charlie met at Baylor. So I don't know that they ever lived around. They weren't very far from each other, but they probably had not known each other till they went to college. And then once they finished, they married.
So when they retired from the foreign mission field in '65, they did make San Antonio their home. Tell us a little bit about the story of their building a duplex, basically right across the street from the original location of Cher Hills.
Yeah, across the street and down. Actually, they lived across the street from the Catholic church. My grandmother spent many hours sitting in her living room, watching out the window and seeing the Catholics come and go to church and go to school. The children would go to school there, and so
that's right. It is
our church was
across.
A little further down the road.
But not. They did walk, right? They did walk to church.
Oh, I feel sure they did. It wasn't far at all.
It was just a stone's throw.
It wasn't very far. But I'm sure as they approached those retirement years, as did my grandparents, who were probably a little older than they were. My grandmother was 3 years older than Aunt Ola. And I'm not sure about my grandfather. But anyway, and actually, my grandfather died pretty quickly. He lived in that duplex, but he didn't live there too long before he passed. But he was kind of worked in the building business some, and as did my father. And I was trying to remember if perhaps my father helped build that building, but I don't know for sure. But they, I'm sure, made plans to have this nice duplex where the two couples could support each other as they, were in those aging years.
Right.
And so
and they definitely did build the duplex themselves. I mean, it was built by them.
By them. Okay. Yeah. So perhaps my dad was in on that.
Yeah.
I would think. I wish he were here today,
I'm sure
so
it was
I could
a
ask
family
him.
affair, kind of.
Probably. And it was a very nice, very comfortable 2-bedroom, 1 bath, modest kitchen, nice living room, dining area together, and both sides were exactly alike. So it was very nice.
So do you remember family gatherings there at the?
I do. When they would be, when Uncle Charlie and Aunt Ola would come home, and obviously this must have been near the time that they came home for good, if they retired in '65, because I was, those were my kind of childhood and then into high school years. I graduated in 1970. But they would, in the times that they were, in their space there on Oblate, they would invite us over for Chinese dinner and stuff like that. And that was kind of interesting because they fixed a somewhat authentic Chinese food, not like the Chinese restaurants we go to today.
Well, there probably weren't even that many Chinese restaurants at the time.
I don't know that we even had one.
Yeah. I mean, so you weren't even exposed to the cuisine through the normal means.
Not too much. Not too much. So
wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, so we might have had a little seaweed.
So you got the real deal.
The real deal.
Oh my! I'm sure they had a lot of practice.
I'm sure they did. So anyway, I can remember that kind of occasion where, and because it was a small home, we didn't all gather there at one time.
So were you all instructed in using the, what do they call those things?
The chopsticks.
Yeah, chopsticks.
Oh, absolutely. They always wanted us to try the chopsticks. But luckily they would take mercy on us and give us a fork after a while so we could get some food down our throat.
Right. Didn't want you leaving hungry, so give you a fork.
Exactly.
Oh, my.
In fact, Aunt Ola was even kind enough when I graduated from high school. Having parties was a big thing back then. And she and another aunt of mine got together and made a Chinese meal for my high school friends. And we had a graduation party at her house. Yeah, with all the, Chinese looking things that they had, their plates and, all kinds of things. So I think my friends were pretty impressed by that.
Well, yeah, I bet.
That was
fun.
Well,
that was really gracious and hospitable of her.
Very. Aunt Ola was, she was very outgoing, gregarious kind of person. Uncle Charlie, much quieter. And, and again, I wasn't around him all that much because even after they came home and retired, he spent a lot of time at the Mid-America Seminary doing, like, as you said, the same kind of work. Mm-hmm. He worked in 3 different seminaries in China. And so...
Well, he actually was president of...
he was.
I think at least 2 of those, maybe all 3.
Maybe all 3. One in China, one in Hong Kong, and then one in Taiwan when they had to leave China because of communism.
Right.
And go to Taiwan. So, yeah.
Do you recall? Do you have any recollections of him talking about his experience in the Japanese war camp?
I don't. I wish just what he wrote. Some of it in this autobiography that he wrote. He tells a little bit about when the Japanese came in. And I didn't even remember that the Japanese had come in and invaded China, of all things, and they were put, his missionary group was put under kind of house rule, so to speak, but they did okay because the Japanese, because they were Americans, they didn't want to get in too much trouble, so the Japanese treated them pretty well, and all, but and then I kept thinking I really thought in my memory bank that he had spent time imprisoned by the communists when communism came into China. He never mentions it in his autobiography. I think he got out before that happened.
Yeah. I think certainly their movements were restricted and things of that nature, but it wasn't a prisoner of war camp like the Japanese. Right. Had used.
He did mention a few of the missionaries that didn't get out the same time they did end up in a concentration camp, and it was a pretty rough one.
Under the communists?
Well, that was actually under the Japanese rule that he talked about, and I'm sure under the communists as well once they came in.
Okay.
But his stories in this book about the work that he did there in China are just amazing. And you know, it was so difficult to get everywhere. You know, we think of China today, of course, as a very metropolitan, you know, advanced society. Well, back then it was very
anything
crude.
but.
Yeah, you know, very
Right.
well, they had some population, not nearly what they have now. But anyway, he would get places on bicycles, by horse. He had a little motorcycle at one time. One time it talks about how the only way to get to this one place he was going to visit was on top of some trucks that would take supplies. 500 miles.
Wow.
500 miles. They would
And those
climb up.
trucks probably did like 15 miles an hour.
Well, actually, he acted like they went pretty fast. It scared him. But they had to sit on top of the supplies
Oh, man.
and hold on to ropes. That's how they got there. I was like, how did they do that?
Oh, man.
So it was.
Well, coming back home
rough.
to San Antonio, you mentioned the party that
Yes.
your Aunt Ola had for her graduation and so forth. I've been told that one of Ola's good friends here was Mary Comalander.
Oh.
Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Okay.
I did not know that.
I've kind of understood that. I haven't visited with Mary to any great extent, but I understand that they were personal
Good friends.
and,
Oh, neat.
and spent a lot of time together, and dinner parties and things of that nature, like you had mentioned.
Oh.
You know.
Unfortunately, those years, like in the 80s, where they finally kind of, were winding down some, not being able to go out and speak and travel so much. So those years that they spent down at Sierra Hills were years that my husband and I were away part of that time, college and stuff like that. But then when we came back to San Antonio, we attended a different church. So unfortunately, I missed those great years that Aunt Ola and Uncle Charlie were right there in Sierra Hills, so close to me. And
Well, you spent six years, I believe, at Mid-America Theological Seminary in Memphis, Tennessee, as a full professor, I think.
yes.
And then another year at Midwest Theological Seminary as an adjunct professor. And so, again, there were some significant gaps in time that they weren't here in
Right.
San Antonio and weren't
Right.
directly connected with Sierra Hills. But they were members here at Sierra Hills for the entire time from '65 until their passing later. So what other recollections do you have?
Well, most of mine are of Aunt Ola,
Right.
because she was around a little bit more, and sometimes she had to come home while he remained in China. But she was a funny person. She didn't mind telling you what she thought you ought to do. And in fact, I was visiting with a cousin of mine yesterday on the phone, and she said, "Oh yeah, well when Benny and I married, she came over to me and said, 'Now Nancy, Benny's a grown man, and you should not call him Benny anymore. You need to call him Ben.'" It's like, okay. And when she found out that he kind of liked to drink beer, was his beverage, she said, "Now you just go get those and you just pour that right down the sink." They didn't have any tolerance for drinking. But
Not in my house.
yeah, right. Don't you even think about it. But she was very kind to always share her experiences. I can remember she came to our GA group one time and spoke about their experience as missionaries. And one story I remember, I don't know why I remember this one story. She talked about how she kept a handkerchief with her all the time, doused in perfume, and she'd kind of, keep it like this if they traveled like to the bigger cities and stuff. She said the odor in China is really strong.
Oh my!
Like, oh, okay. I hadn't really thought about that.
Right.
But that was one thing that kind of stuck in my mind.
Take your hand.
Ooh, make sure you got your hanky when
perfume.
you go to China. But what else did she do? She just, liked to speak her mind.
Yeah.
We had a great couple in our church that were faithful members of the choir, and he somehow fell, broke his leg or something, so he was not able to get up into the choir loft with that leg like that until it healed. So for several weeks or months, they sat out in the audience, in the congregation during the church service. And so Aunt Ola went over to them one time and she said, "Shirley, why aren't you up in the choir?" And she said, "Well, Bennett here broke his leg and he just can't climb those stairs." And she was like, "Well, I don't know what his leg has to do with your voice." So I think she's probably in the choir the next Sunday. I don't know. But she felt like people should do their best and use their gifts and don't waste it.
Right. Make the most of the.
That's right.
The time. Right. Redeem the time.
That's right.
Wow. Well, this has been really fun, Priscilla. I've really enjoyed this. Just again, kind of seeing these people as people, and not just they were great men and women of God who did great and wonderful things for the kingdom, and rightly should be remembered like that. But I think that it's also important that we recognize who they were as people, and that they had families, and they had dinners, and they had parties, and they had friends, and so forth, and really humanize the lives of Dr. Charles and Ola Culpepper. So thank you for providing that kind of glimpse and insight today. Well, thank you very much for tuning in to the show today, to this episode of A Legacy of Revival, the SHBC Connection. We're interested in showing the relationship, the legacy, the heritage that we have as a body here at Cherry Hills with the life and ministry of Dr. Charles and Ola Culpepper. And today you've gotten a personal glimpse of their lives as members here at Cherry Hills and residents here in San Antonio. Hope you've enjoyed it at least as much as I have, and we'll look forward to seeing you again at our future episodes. Thank you, and God bless.